I was stacking the last cord of oak when I saw her marching down the path toward my lakefront property, clipboard in hand like some kind of suburban warrior, and I knew my peaceful Saturday morning was about to go straight to hell. Karren Thornton, president of the Pinewood Lakes HOA in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, had that particular look on her face that I'd come to recognize over the past 3 years living in this community. It was the look that said someone had violated her personal interpretation of the bylaws and she was about to make it everyone's problem. She was a stocky woman in her early 50s, always dressed like she was heading to a business meeting even on weekends, with her blonde hair cut in that aggressive bob that seemed to be standard issue for HOA presidents nationwide. "Mr. Xavier," she called out, her voice carrying across the morning air with the kind of authority that made dogs hide and children stop playing. "Kenneth Xavier." I set down the piece of wood I was holding and wiped my hands on my jeans. My property sat right on the edge of Lake Coeur d'Alene, a beautiful piece of land I'd bought 5 years ago when I was still married. The divorce had been rough, but at least I got to keep this place. The house was a modest 2-story cabin-style home with a wraparound deck that looked out over the water. And yes, I had a woodpile. A significant woodpile, actually, sitting about 20 feet from the lake's edge, neatly stacked between 2 trees where it stayed dry and accessible. "Morning, Karren," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. "What can I do for you?" She stopped at the edge of my property, her sensible heels sinking slightly into the soft earth near the lake. She pulled them out with a grimace and took a step back onto firmer ground. "I'm here on official HOA business, Mr. Xavier. I've received multiple complaints about your situation here." She gestured at my woodpile with her clipboard, like it was a pile of rotting garbage. "My firewood?" "Your unsightly storage of combustible materials within the lake zone," she corrected, reading from her clipboard. According to the Pinewood Lakes HOA Covenant, Section 12, Paragraph 4, no resident shall maintain storage of materials deemed unsightly or potentially hazardous within 50 feet of the community waterfront areas. I felt my jaw tighten. "Karren, this is my private property. My deed goes right down to the water. I checked before I moved the wood here." "Your property may extend to the water, but the aesthetics of the lake are a community concern," she said, her voice taking on that particular tone that suggested she'd rehearsed this speech. "The lake can be seen from the community paths, from other residents' properties, and from the common areas. Your woodpile is an eyesore that affects everyone's property values." I looked at my woodpile. It was neat, well stacked, organized by wood type even. I had oak on one end, maple in the middle, and some cherry wood on the other end. It was covered with a tarp during rain, and I'd even built a small retaining border to keep it from spreading. I'd spent actual time making it look presentable. "It's firewood, Karren. Neatly stacked firewood." "It's a violation," she countered. "I need you to move it within 7 days, or the HOA will be forced to take action." "What kind of action?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Fines, daily fines of $50 until compliance is achieved, and if that doesn't work, we can place a lien on your property." My hands clenched into fists at my sides. "You're threatening to put a lien on my house because of firewood?" "I'm not threatening anything, Mr. Xavier. I'm informing you of the consequences of remaining in violation of the covenants you agreed to when you purchased property in this community." She made a note on her clipboard. "You have 7 days. I suggest you use them wisely." She turned and walked away, her heels clicking on the stone path that led back toward the main community area. I stood there, breathing slowly through my nose, trying not to let my anger get the better of me. This was classic HOA overreach, the kind of petty tyranny that made people hate these organizations. But here's the thing Karren didn't know, or maybe had forgotten. For the past 3 years, I'd been the primary supplier of firewood for the community fire pit. The fire pit was one of the main attractions of Pinewood Lakes, a large stone structure in the central commons area where residents gathered for community events, weekend gatherings, and holiday celebrations. The HOA had built it when the neighborhood was first developed, but they'd never budgeted for maintaining a supply of firewood. That's where I came in. I owned a small woodworking business, Xavier Custom Furniture, and I had access to a lot of quality hardwood. Offcuts, scraps, and pieces that weren't suitable for furniture, but burned beautifully. I also had connections with tree removal services in the area who gave me wood for free in exchange for taking it off their hands. Every couple of weeks, I'd load up my truck with seasoned firewood and stock the community woodshed next to the fire pit. Nobody asked me to do it. I just did it because I liked having fires, and I liked the community aspect of people gathering around the pit. I never asked for payment, never asked for recognition. I just did it because it was the neighborly thing to do. But as I stood there watching Karren disappear down the path, I made a decision. If she wanted to play hardball about my woodpile, fine. But I was done being the community's free firewood supplier. That evening, I drafted an email to the HOA board. I kept it professional and brief. Dear Pinewood Lakes HOA Board, after 3 years of voluntarily supplying firewood to the community fire pit, I am officially discontinuing this service effective immediately. This decision is due to personal reasons and should not be interpreted as anything other than a reallocation of my time and resources. The community woodshed currently has approximately 2 weeks' worth of wood remaining based on typical usage. Best regards, Kenneth Xavier. I hit send before I could second-guess myself. Then, I called my buddy Marcus, who owned a property outside the HOA boundaries about 2 miles away. Marcus, you still have that empty shed on your back lot? Yeah, why? How would you feel about storing some firewood for me? I'll give you a cord for your trouble. Marcus laughed. HOA giving you grief again? You have no idea. Bring it over. God knows I'm not going to join one of those neighborhoods. I'll take free firewood any day. Over the next week, I rented a truck and spent 3 full days moving my entire woodpile to Marcus's property. It was backbreaking work, loading and unloading several cords of wood, but I was determined. Every time I thought about quitting, I remembered Karren's smug face and found new energy. On day 6, I got a follow-up from Karren. She actually showed up to inspect my property, accompanied by 2 other board members, a thin, nervous-looking man named Gerald, and a younger woman named Susan, who seemed uncomfortable being there. I see you've complied with the directive, Karren said, walking around the area where my woodpile had been. This is much better. Don't you agree, Susan? Susan glanced at me apologetically. Yes, it's cleared. Good, Karren made a note on her clipboard. I'm glad we could resolve this without further action. You see, Mr. Xavier, when everyone follows the rules, the community benefits. I didn't trust myself to speak, so I just nodded. Karren seemed satisfied with that and led her little group away. Gerald kept looking back at me like he wanted to say something but didn't have the courage. It was 2.5 weeks later when I got the next communication from the HOA. This time, it was an email from Gerald, who apparently was the vice president and secretary. Dear Mr. Xavier, the HOA board has noticed that the community fire pit woodshed is currently empty. We've received numerous complaints from residents who have planned gatherings around the fire pit only to find no wood available. Could you please provide your typical supply as soon as possible? Several families have upcoming events planned, and we would hate for them to be disappointed. Thank you for your continued community service. Best, Gerald Patterson 5P, Pinewood Lakes HOA. I read the email 3 times, a smile slowly spreading across my face. I waited a day before responding, wanting to make sure I phrased this perfectly. Dear Gerald, thank you for reaching out. As indicated in my email from 3 weeks ago, I am no longer providing firewood to the community fire pit. This service was always voluntary on my part and was never part of any official agreement or obligation. I suggest the HOA either budget for purchasing firewood from a commercial supplier or organize a community volunteer system for maintaining the woodshed. Best regards, Kenneth Xavier. The response came within an hour, and this time it was from Karren herself. Mr. Xavier, your provision of firewood to the community has been an established practice for 3 years. Many residents have come to rely on this service, and your sudden withdrawal is causing significant disruption to community activities. I'm sure we can discuss this matter reasonably. Perhaps there was a misunderstanding regarding the relocation of your personal woodpile. Regards, Karren Thornton, President, Pinewood Lakes, HOA. Oh, now it was a misunderstanding. Now she wanted to be reasonable. I felt a warm satisfaction spreading through my chest. I decided not to respond immediately. Let her sit with it. 2 days later, on a Saturday evening, I was grilling on my deck when I heard a commotion from the community commons, voices raised, someone shouting. I grabbed a beer and wandered over, curious. A crowd had gathered around the fire pit, maybe 20 people. Someone had attempted to start a fire using newspaper and what looked like pieces of cardboard, but it had mostly just created smoke. Karren was there, her face red, arguing with a tall man I recognized as Tom Henderson from 3 streets over. "This is ridiculous," Tom was saying. "We've been planning this gathering for 2 weeks. My kids invited their friends and now we have no fire." "I understand your frustration, Tom," Karren said, though her tone suggested she didn't understand at all. "But the HOA cannot be responsible for every resident's personal entertainment plans." "The fire pit is a community amenity," a woman shouted. "That's literally why we pay HOA fees. Your fees go toward maintaining common areas, landscaping, and administration costs," Karren shot back. "They don't include complimentary firewood service." "They did for the past 3 years," someone else yelled. That's when Karren spotted me at the edge of the crowd. Her eyes narrowed. "Mr. Xavier, since you're here, perhaps you could help resolve this situation?" Everyone turned to look at me. I took a sip of my beer, feeling the weight of all those eyes. "I'd love to help," I said calmly, "but as I informed the board, I'm no longer providing firewood. That was a voluntary service, and I've chosen to discontinue it." "But why?" someone asked. "You always kept the woodshed stocked." I could have explained. I could have told them about Karren's demand that I move my woodpile, about the threats of fines and liens, about the petty exercise of power over something that wasn't hurting anyone. But I didn't. Instead, I said, "Personal reasons. I'm sure the HOA can arrange an alternative solution." "You're being childish," Karren snapped, her professional demeanor cracking. "This is because of the woodpile situation, isn't it? You're punishing the entire community because you were asked to follow simple rules." "I'm not punishing anyone," I said evenly. "I'm simply not providing a free service anymore. There's a difference. This is petty and vindictive." "No, Karren. Petty is threatening to fine someone $50 a day over neatly stacked firewood that wasn't hurting anyone. I'm just allocating my resources differently." The crowd started murmuring. People were looking at Karren now, questions in their eyes. "What's she talking about?" Tom asked. "What woodpile?" "It's not relevant," Karren said quickly. "The point is." "She demanded I move my personal woodpile from my own property because she deemed it unsightly," I interrupted. "Threatened fines and a lien if I didn't comply. So I complied. I moved it, all of it, to storage off-site, where, coincidentally, I don't have easy access to it anymore for community donations." You could see the understanding dawning on faces around the circle. Tom's expression went from confused to angry. "You harassed him over firewood, and now you're surprised he's not giving us firewood?" "I didn't harass anyone," Karren protested. "I enforced the covenants that everyone agreed to." "His woodpile was neat," Susan spoke up quietly. Everyone turned to look at her. She flushed but continued. "I was there when we inspected. It was organized and covered. I didn't think it was unsightly at all. I actually said that, but—" She trailed off, glancing at Karren. "But what?" someone prompted. "But Karren said it didn't matter what we thought, that she had received complaints." "From who?" Tom demanded. Karren's face was now the color of a ripe tomato. "That's confidential HOA business. Board matters are not subject to community interrogation." "So let me get this straight," Tom said, his voice rising. "You forced Kenneth to move his woodpile based on some mystery complaints, probably made them up yourself, and now you're shocked that he's not going out of his way to help the community anymore?" "That's not I didn't," Karren sputtered. "I decided it was time to leave. I'd made my point, and I wasn't interested in watching Karren squirm, satisfying as it might be." I finished my beer and headed back to my house, leaving the crowd to their debate. The next few weeks were interesting. I got several visitors, neighbors stopping by to ask if I'd reconsider. Most of them were nice about it, and I explained the situation calmly. Many of them didn't even realize I'd been the one supplying the wood all along, which was both amusing and a little annoying. I'd spent 3 years hauling firewood, and apparently, people just thought it magically appeared. One visitor was particularly memorable. An older gentleman named Richard Kozloff, who lived on the other side of the community, stopped by on a Wednesday evening. He was in his 70s, a retired engineer with a sharp mind and a no-nonsense attitude. "Kenneth," he said, shaking my hand firmly, "I wanted to thank you." For what, not providing firewood? I asked Riley. He laughed. For standing up to that woman. Karren's been running this HOA like her personal fiefdom for 2 years now. Ever since she took over as president, it's been one petty rule enforcement after another. Someone needed to push back. I'm not trying to start a war, I said. I just got tired of being taken for granted. As you should be. Listen, I'm planning to run for the board in the next election. We need some sensible people in there. Would you consider it? Me? On the HOA board? Why not? You obviously care about the community, or you wouldn't have been hauling firewood for 3 years, and you've got backbone, which is more than I can say for Gerald and Susan. I thought about it. The idea of being on the HOA board had never appealed to me. It seemed like a thankless position filled with petty disputes and angry neighbors. But then again, maybe that's exactly why people like Karren ended up in charge, because reasonable people didn't want to deal with it. Let me think about it, I told Richard. He nodded. Fair enough. The election's in 4 months. Let me know. Meanwhile, the firewood situation was becoming a genuine problem for the community. The fire pit sat empty and unused. I heard through the grapevine that Karren had tried to order wood from a commercial supplier, but the quotes she received were astronomical. Premium seasoned hardwood wasn't cheap, and the amount needed to keep the community woodshed stocked year-round would have required a significant budget increase. She'd proposed adding a special assessment fee to cover it, $50 per household per quarter. That had gone over about as well as you'd expect. People were already paying hefty HOA fees, and the idea of paying extra for something they'd been getting for free was met with resistance. There was an emergency board meeting scheduled, open to all residents. I debated whether to attend. Part of me wanted to stay home, to let them figure it out on their own. But another part of me, the part that had genuinely enjoyed the community fires, wanted to see what would happen. The meeting was held in the community center, a nice building with a large meeting room that could hold about 100 people. It was packed. Apparently, the firewood issue had touched a nerve. Karren sat at the front table with Gerald and Susan, looking decidedly less confident than usual. Her aggressive bob seemed to have deflated somehow, and she wasn't making as much eye contact with the crowd. I call this meeting to order, she said, tapping a gavel that seemed unnecessarily dramatic. We're here to discuss the community fire pit situation and potential solutions moving forward. The solution is to stop harassing Kenneth Xavier, someone shouted from the back. There were murmurs of agreement throughout the room. Karren's face tightened. Mr. Xavier was in violation of the covenants. The board had an obligation to enforce them. Show us the complaints, Tom Henderson called out. He was sitting in the front row with a notepad. You said you received multiple complaints about his woodpile. I want to see them. That's confidential. Actually, it's not. Richard Kozloff stood up, holding a stapled document. I pulled the HOA bylaws, and complaint records are supposed to be available to homeowners upon request. I'm formally requesting to see the complaints filed against Kenneth Xavier regarding his woodpile. Karren's mouth opened and closed. Susan looked uncomfortable, and Gerald was staring at his hands. Well, Tom pressed. There was one complaint, Susan said quietly. Everyone turned to look at her. She kept her eyes on the table. Only one complaint was filed. Karren received it and determined it warranted action. Who filed it? Richard asked. I did, Karren said, lifting her chin defiantly. I filed a complaint based on my observation that the woodpile violated the aesthetic standards of the community. The room erupted. People were shouting, standing up, pointing. Karren had to bang her gavel repeatedly to restore order. You complained about your own neighbor and then enforced your own complaint? Tom was standing now, his voice cutting through the noise. That's not enforcing community standards. That's a personal vendetta. It is not a vendetta. The woodpile was visible from multiple vantage points, and now we have no firewood, a woman yelled. Good job, Karren. The board is working on solutions, Karren said desperately. We're exploring budget options, which include charging us extra money, someone else interjected, to pay for something we were getting for free. Mr. Xavier's donation of firewood was never an official arrangement, Karren protested. The community should not have become dependent on one person's generosity. But we did, Richard said calmly. And instead of appreciating that generosity, you drove him away with petty bureaucratic nonsense. That's bad leadership, Karren. The meeting devolved from there. Gerald tried to present some numbers on commercial firewood costs, but nobody wanted to hear it. People were angry, and they weren't being subtle about where they were directing that anger. Finally, after 2 hours of heated debate and finger-pointing, Karren adjourned the meeting without any resolution. I slipped out quietly, not wanting to get caught in the parking lot crowd. But Tom caught up with me anyway. "Kenneth, wait up." I stopped, turning to face him. "Hey, Tom. Listen, I want to apologize. I didn't realize you were the one supplying the wood all along. I saw you loading the woodshed plenty of times, but I just never put it together that it was all you." "It's fine. Like Karren said, the community shouldn't be dependent on one person. Maybe not, but they also shouldn't bite the hand that feeds them, or heats them, whatever." He ran a hand through his hair. "Is there any way you'd reconsider? I know what Karren did was wrong, but the rest of us are suffering for it." I felt a twinge of guilt. Tom was a good guy, and his kids were sweet, but I also knew that if I gave in now, nothing would change. Karren would continue her petty tyranny, and I'd be back to being taken for granted. "I'll tell you what," I said. "If the community wants firewood, organize a volunteer system. Different households take turns supplying wood. That way, nobody gets burned out and everyone contributes. I'll even participate in that." Tom's face brightened. That's a great idea. Would you help set it up?" "Sure, but it can't come from me. If I suggest it, Karren will shoot it down just to spite me. It needs to come from residents." He nodded slowly. "I can do that. I'll talk to Richard and some others. We'll propose it at the next meeting." There you go. Community problem, community solution. We shook hands, and I headed home feeling a little better about the situation. Maybe this whole mess would actually result in something positive, a real community effort instead of one person carrying the load. But I should have known it wouldn't be that simple. Nothing involving HOAs ever is. 2 weeks later, I received a certified letter from the HOA. My stomach sank when I saw it. Certified letters were never good news. Inside was a formal notice of violation. Apparently, I was now in violation of Covenant Section 8, Paragraph 12, which required homeowners to participate in community enhancement activities as determined necessary by the board. I read the letter 3 times, my blood pressure rising with each reading. They were claiming that my refusal to supply firewood constituted a failure to participate in community enhancement. The fine was $100, with an additional $100 per month until I resumed established community contributions. This was insane. This was beyond petty. This was Karren abusing her power in the most blatant way possible. I called a lawyer, not because I intended to pay these fines, hell would freeze over first, but because I needed to understand my legal standing. The lawyer, a woman named Jennifer Pierce who specialized in HOA disputes, listened to my story and then laughed. Not a polite chuckle, but a genuine, from the belly laugh. "I'm sorry," she said, catching her breath. "I shouldn't laugh, but this is one of the most egregious overreaches I've seen in a while, and I see a lot. So I don't have to pay it?" "Absolutely not. This covenant section is meant for things like mandatory lawn maintenance or snow removal from your own property. It cannot be interpreted to compel voluntary donations of personal property. That's not even legally enforceable. It might actually violate your constitutional rights under certain interpretations." "So what do I do?" "Write a response letter. I'll draft it for you. Firmly but professionally decline the fine and state your legal basis. Then we wait and see if they're stupid enough to pursue it further. And if they do, then we sue them for harassment and abuse of authority, and we'll probably win. HOA boards have broad powers, but they're not unlimited. This is so far over the line that any judge would slap them down." Jennifer drafted a beautiful letter. It was 3 pages of polite legal language that essentially said, "Go pound sand" in the most professional way possible. It cited case law, covenant limitations, and constitutional principles. I signed it, sent it certified mail to match their energy, and settled in to wait. The response came from the HOA's lawyer, which told me they were taking this seriously. Their lawyer's letter was more cautious than Karren's had been, but it still maintained that I had established a pattern of community contribution that other residents had come to rely upon, and that my sudden withdrawal constituted a disruption to community harmony. Jennifer's response to that was even better. She pointed out that establishing a pattern of voluntary giving did not create a legal obligation to continue that giving, and that their logic would mean anyone who ever helped a neighbor would be legally obligated to continue that help indefinitely. She invited them to pursue the matter in court if they wished, noting that she would be happy to countersue for harassment, abuse of authority, and legal fees. That shut them up. The fine was quietly withdrawn, and I received a terse email from Gerald stating that the board had reconsidered its position on this matter. But the damage to Karren's reputation was done. The story of her self-filed complaint and subsequent attempt to fine me for not donating firewood had spread throughout the community. People were calling for her resignation. Richard Kozloff and Tom Henderson had organized a petition to hold a special election for board positions, and they had more than enough signatures. The special election was scheduled for 6 weeks out. Richard was running for president, Tom for vice president, and they were looking for a third person to round out the board. Susan had announced she wasn't running again. She seemed relieved to be done with the whole thing. Gerald was running again, but nobody expected him to win after his spineless performance during the firewood saga. "You should run," Richard told me over coffee at a local shop in downtown Coeur d'Alene. We were sitting outside enjoying the late spring weather and the view of the lake. "I'm not really board material," I said. Neither was Karren, and look how much damage she did. We need people who understand that an HOA is supposed to serve the community, not rule it. "I'll think about it." But I already knew I was going to do it. This whole situation had shown me that staying out of community governance just meant letting people like Karren take control. If I wanted to live in a reasonable community, I needed to help make it reasonable. I submitted my candidacy the next day. The campaign, if you could call it that, was interesting. Karren tried to paint me as vindictive and uncooperative. She sent out an email blast to all residents talking about the importance of respecting community standards and following established rules. She never mentioned me by name, but everyone knew who she was talking about. Richard, Tom, and I responded with our own email, laying out our vision for the HOA. We wanted to focus on actual community needs, like maintaining common areas and organizing genuine community events. We wanted transparent board meetings where residents could actually voice concerns. We wanted to review all the covenants and eliminate or modify the ones that were overly restrictive or outdated. And we talked about the firewood situation, not to attack Karren, but to illustrate a point. We noted that for 3 years, community needs were met through voluntary cooperation. When that cooperation was destroyed through heavy-handed enforcement of questionable rules, everyone suffered. We promised a more collaborative approach. The election was held on a Tuesday evening in early July. The turnout was unprecedented. Apparently, the firewood drama had engaged people in a way that normal HOA politics never did. Who knew that threatening someone's access to cozy fires would be the thing to finally motivate civic participation? The results weren't even close. Richard won the presidency with 78% of the vote. Tom won vice president with 81%. I won the third board position with 74%. Karren received 18% for president, and Gerald got 19% for the general board position. Karren didn't attend the results meeting. She sent an email resignation effective immediately. Gerald showed up, congratulated us graciously, and admitted that he was relieved to step down. He'd never wanted the position in the first place. He'd just been trying to help, and it had become more stressful than it was worth. Our first official board meeting was held a week later. We had a full agenda, but the first item was the one that people actually cared about, the fire pit wood situation. "I've been talking to people," Tom said, pulling out a spreadsheet, "and I've got 15 households willing to participate in a rotating wood supply system. Each household commits to supplying 1 full load of firewood twice per season. We'll set up a schedule, send reminders, and the HOA will maintain the woodshed structure itself." "That's a great start," Richard said. "Kenneth, would you be willing to participate?" "Absolutely," I said, "but I've got another idea too. My woodworking business generates a lot of quality scrap wood. Instead of hauling it to Marcus's place, I could bring it directly to the community shed, assuming we make it clear that this is a business disposal arrangement, not a personal donation. I was going to have to pay for disposal anyway, So if the HOA wants to save me that cost by taking the wood, that's a mutually beneficial arrangement. Tom grinned. So you'd basically be doing what you were doing before, but now it's framed as a business arrangement? Exactly. It protects everyone. I'm not being taken advantage of because I'm getting free disposal service. The community isn't dependent on my generosity because it's a business deal that could be terminated or replaced at any time. And if I ever sell my business or move, there's no expectation that I'll continue. Richard nodded approvingly. That's smart. We'll draft a simple agreement. You provide scrap wood disposal. The HOA accepts it for community use. Either party can terminate with 30 days' notice. And we'll still maintain the rotating resident supply system as backup, Tom added, so we're not solely dependent on Kenneth's business. We hammered out the details over the next hour. It felt good, working with reasonable people toward practical solutions. This was what an HOA was supposed to be. The agreement was formalized the following week. I started bringing my scrap wood to the community woodshed again, and several other residents began contributing as well. The rotating system Tom set up worked beautifully. People actually enjoyed the responsibility, taking pride in supplying quality wood for community fires. Within a month, the woodshed was better stocked than it had ever been under my solo operation. We had oak, maple, cherry, and even some applewood that burned with a beautiful smell. People started gathering at the fire pit again on weekend evenings, and the whole community felt warmer. And I don't just mean because of the fires, but the story doesn't end there. Because in August, something interesting happened. I was working in my shop one afternoon when I got a call from a blocked number. "Is this Kenneth Xavier?" a woman's voice asked. "Speaking." "Mr. Xavier, my name is Patricia Mills. I'm the president of the Riverfront Community HOA in Sandpoint. I've heard about your situation with your former board president and the firewood resolution. I was wondering if you might be willing to speak at our next board training session." I was confused. Board training? Yes, we're part of a regional coalition of HOAs in northern Idaho. We hold quarterly training sessions for board members, covering best practices, legal issues, that sort of thing. Your case has become something of a teaching moment in HOA circles. We'd like you to share your perspective on community engagement and reasonable governance. You want me to speak to other HOA boards? If you're willing, we'd pay for your time, of course. And honestly, I think a lot of boards could benefit from hearing how a well-intentioned community relationship was nearly destroyed by overreach and how it was ultimately resolved. I thought about Karren, about her petty enforcement and abuse of authority, about how her actions had backfired so spectacularly that she'd been voted out and I'd been voted in, about how many other communities might have their own Karens making life miserable over trivial issues. "I'll do it," I said, "but only if you'll let me be blunt." Patricia laughed. "Mr. Xavier, blunt is exactly what we need." I spoke at 3 different HOA training sessions over the next 6 months. Each time I told the story of the woodpile, the threats, the retaliation that wasn't really retaliation, and the eventual resolution. I talked about the difference between enforcing reasonable rules and using rules as weapons. I talked about how communities are built on goodwill and how quickly that goodwill can be destroyed by heavy-handed governance. The response was always interesting. Some board members got defensive, claiming they had to enforce rules or chaos would reign. But others had that look of recognition in their eyes. They'd seen their own Karens, or maybe they'd been Karens themselves without realizing it. Those were the ones who asked the best questions afterward. Meanwhile, back in Pinewood Lakes, things were good, really good. Richard, Tom, and I worked well together as a board. We reviewed all the covenants and modified or eliminated 17 of them that were either overly restrictive, outdated, or unenforceable. We started monthly community gatherings at the fire pit with different households volunteering to host by providing snacks or drinks. Attendance was the highest it had been in years. My furniture business was thriving too. Turns out that speaking at HOA events was decent networking. I'd gotten 3 custom furniture orders from people I'd met at those sessions, including a beautiful commission for a lake house in Sandpoint. One evening in late October, about 8 months after the whole thing started, I was sitting by the community fire pit with about 30 other residents. We were roasting marshmallows and telling stories, and someone's kid was playing guitar pretty well for a teenager. The fire was burning bright with a mix of woods, including some apple wood I'd brought that gave off a sweet smell. Tom sat down next to me, holding 2 beers. He handed me one. "You know," he said, "I never properly thanked you." "For what?" "For not rolling over. When Karren came at you with that woodpile nonsense, you could have just moved it and kept supplying the wood, kept your head down, avoided the conflict." "I thought about it," I admitted, "but I was tired of being taken for granted." "I get that now. We all do." He gestured at the fire, the crowd of neighbors laughing and talking. "This whole community was taking you for granted. Hell, I didn't even know you were the one supplying the wood until that meeting. That's embarrassing." "You weren't supposed to know. I didn't do it for recognition." "I know, but you should have had it anyway. Appreciation matters." He took a sip of his beer. "You stood up for yourself, and in doing that, you kind of stood up for all of us. You showed us that we didn't have to accept petty tyranny just because someone had a clipboard and a title." I felt my throat tighten a little. "Thanks, Tom." "No, thank you." He clinked his beer against mine. "To standing up to Karens with clipboards," I laughed. "I'll drink to that." We sat there for a while, watching the fire and listening to the guitar music and the sound of community laughter. Someone added more wood to the fire, and the flames jumped higher, casting dancing shadows across the faces around the circle. Richard came over, pulled up a chair. "Kenneth, I just got off the phone with the Idaho HOA Coalition. They want to do a case study on our community transformation, publish it in their newsletter, use it in training materials." "Really?" "Yep, they're calling it From Conflict to Community, the Pinewood Lakes story." "Pretty catchy. Are they going to mention the woodpile?" "Oh, that's the centerpiece. Apparently, HOA President's woodpile vendetta backfires spectacularly is exactly the kind of cautionary tale they want to share." Tom laughed. "Karren's going to love that." "Actually," Richard said, "I heard from Susan that Karren moved, bought a condo in Spokane, one of those high rises with no HOA." "Good for her," I said, and I meant it. "Maybe she'll be happier somewhere she doesn't have to enforce rules." "Or where there's nobody to enforce them on," Tom added. We sat there as the evening grew darker and the fire burned brighter. More people arrived, adding to the circle of chairs. Someone brought out hot chocolate for the kids. The teenager with the guitar started playing a song everyone knew, and people sang along, some in tune, most not, but nobody cared. This was what community was supposed to be, not rules and regulations and fines for infractions, but people coming together, sharing space and warmth and time, supporting each other not because they had to, but because they wanted to. My phone buzzed with a text. It was Marcus. "Hey man, you still need that storage space? Because my shed is full of your wood and I could use it back." I smiled and texted back, "Come grab whatever you want. Free firewood, remember? I don't need the space anymore." A moment later, "You back to supplying the HOA?" Me. "Something like that, but this time it's different." Marcus. "Different how?" Me. "This time they appreciate it." I put my phone away and added another log to the fire, watching the sparks spiral up into the dark sky. The log was a nice piece of cherry, reddish and smooth, that would burn slow and sweet. I'd cut it 3 months ago specifically for nights like this, had known exactly how it would burn before I ever brought it to the woodshed. That was the thing about firewood. You had to plan ahead, had to season it properly, had to know what you were working with. You couldn't rush it, and you couldn't fake it. Green wood didn't burn right no matter how much you wanted it to, and badly stacked wood would rot before it ever warmed anyone. Communities were the same way. They needed time, care, and proper maintenance. They needed people willing to do the work, not for recognition or reward, but because that's what made a place worth living in. And they needed to be protected from people who saw rules as weapons instead of tools. Karren had taught me that, in her own backwards way. By trying to enforce her vision of perfection, by treating a neighbor's contribution as a problem to be solved, she'd shown the whole community what happened when authority was abused. She'd created the very conflict she'd claimed to be preventing. And in doing so, she'd made us all stronger, made us pay attention, get involved, take responsibility for our own community instead of leaving it to whoever was willing to wield a clipboard. The fire popped, sending up a shower of sparks. The kid with the guitar transitioned into another song, something slower this time. A couple stood up and started swaying to the music, dancing in the firelight. Others watched and smiled. Susan showed up, looking hesitant. She hadn't been to many community gatherings since the board election. I waved her over, and Tom immediately stood to offer his chair. "Thanks," she said quietly. "I wasn't sure if I should come." "Why wouldn't you?" I asked. "After everything with the board, I feel like I should have stood up to Karren more, should have said something." "You did say something," I reminded her. "At that first community meeting, you spoke up about the woodpile inspection. That took courage." "Not enough courage?" "Susan, you're here now. That's what matters." Tom gestured at the fire. "We've got plenty of wood, great company, and someone actually playing guitar in tune. What more could you want?" She smiled, her shoulders relaxing. "When you put it like that." Richard joined us, carrying a tray of cookies his wife had made. Fresh baked, still warm. We spent the next 2 hours there, talking and laughing and watching the fire burn down to coals. People came and went, some staying for a few minutes, others settling in for the evening. The teenager finally put down the guitar, and someone else pulled up music on a phone, connecting to a portable speaker. The music was soft, just background, allowing conversation to flow naturally. Around 10 o'clock, the crowd started thinning out. Families with young kids headed home first, then the older couples, until finally it was just a core group of maybe 8 of us, the dedicated fire people who didn't want the evening to end. "We should do this more often," Tom said. "Not just the monthly gatherings, but spontaneous ones, like tonight." "Nothing's stopping us," I said. "We've got the wood, the pit, and the people. All we need is to show up." "Kenneth's right," Richard said. "The best things in a community are the ones that happen organically, not the ones that get scheduled and mandated." "Speaking of organic," Tom said, "I've been thinking about starting a community garden. There's that empty lot near the entrance that's just grass right now. We could turn it into raised beds, get people growing vegetables." "I like that idea," Susan said. "I've always wanted to garden, but never had the space at my place." "We could do a tool share too," I added. "I've got extra tools in my shop. I bet a lot of people have equipment they only use occasionally. Lawnmowers, leaf blowers, that kind of thing. Share them instead of everyone buying their own." "And a community skill share," someone else suggested. "People teaching what they know. You could teach woodworking, Kenneth." Ideas started flowing, each person building on the others. This was the energy that had been missing before, when the HOA was just about enforcement and rules. This was creativity and enthusiasm, people actually engaged in building something together. By the time the fire burned down to glowing coals and we finally called it a night, we had plans for 3 new community initiatives, a list of volunteers, and a sense of excitement that I hadn't felt in years. Walking back to my house, I paused at the spot where my woodpile used to be. The ground was still slightly compressed where the logs had sat, a ghost of the conflict that had started this whole thing. In a weird way, I was grateful for it. Grateful for Karren's overreach, grateful for the conflict that had forced the community to pay attention, grateful for the opportunity to help build something better. My phone rang. It was Jennifer Pierce, the lawyer who'd helped me fight the bogus fine. "Kenneth, sorry to call so late. I just heard from the Idaho HOA Coalition. They want to use your case in their new board member training program. They're asking permission to share the legal documents, emails, everything." "That's fine with me, whatever helps prevent other people from dealing with petty HOA nonsense." "Good, because I already said yes, but there's more. They want me to develop a whole section on HOA overreach and legal boundaries, and they want you to co-present. It would be regular speaking gigs, decent pay, traveling around to different HOA communities." "Jennifer, I run a furniture business. I don't have time to become a professional HOA speaker." "What if I told you the demand is high enough that you could do this full time? I've gotten calls from HOAs in Washington, Montana, even Oregon. Everyone wants to hear the woodpile story, and more importantly, they want to learn how to avoid becoming the villain in their own community's story." I stood there in the dark, looking at my house, then back toward the fire pit where the coals were still glowing faintly. I thought about Karren and her clipboard, about the 3 years of unacknowledged firewood delivery, about the conflict and resolution that followed. "Let me think about it," I said. "This has been a weird year, and I'm not sure I want to turn personal drama into a career." "Fair enough. But Kenneth, you've got a gift for explaining this stuff in a way that people understand. You're not preachy, you're not angry, you just tell the story. That's rare. Think about how many communities could benefit from that. After we hung up, I sat on my deck for a while, looking out at the lake. The water was calm, reflecting the moon. Somewhere out there, a loon called, its haunting cry echoing across the water. I thought about all the communities out there, all the Karens wielding clipboards, all the reasonable people being bullied by petty rules. I thought about how one person standing up had changed things here, had rippled out into something bigger. Maybe Jennifer was right. Maybe there was value in sharing this story, in helping other communities avoid the same mistakes. It wasn't about revenge or making Karren look bad. It was about showing that there was a better way. My phone buzzed with a text from Tom. "Thanks for tonight. My kids said it was the best evening they've had all year. We're lucky to have you in this community." I smiled and texted back, "We're all lucky to have each other." And that was the truth. Not the polite kind of truth you say to be nice, but the real kind that you feel in your bones. Community wasn't about rules and enforcement. It was about people showing up for each other, contributing what they could and appreciating what they received. The next morning, I called Jennifer back. "I'll do it," I said. "The speaking, the training, all of it. But on one condition." "What's that?" "We don't just talk about what went wrong. We talk about what went right. We talk about how the community came together, how reasonable people found reasonable solutions. We make it about building up, not just tearing down." "I can work with that. When can you start?" "Give me 2 weeks to clear my furniture orders and set up my shop for lower production. Then I'm all yours." Those 2 weeks were a whirlwind. I completed 3 pending furniture orders, trained my part-time assistant to handle basic repairs and small projects, and set up a system for managing my business while traveling. It helped that the furniture work had always been more of a passion project than a primary income source. I could afford to scale back. The first speaking engagement was in Missoula, Montana, at a regional HOA conference. I was nervous, standing backstage in a hotel conference room, listening to someone introduce me as the man who stood up to HOA overreach and transformed his community. When I walked out, I saw about 200 people in the audience. Board members, property managers, HOA lawyers. They looked skeptical, tired, like they'd been through too many boring presentations already that day. I started with a question. How many of you have ever made someone's life harder because you were following the rules? A few hands went up tentatively. I waited. More hands rose. Eventually, about half the room had their hands raised. "That's honest," I said, "and I appreciate it. Because here's the thing. Rules matter. Structure matters. An HOA without rules is just chaos. But rules without common sense, without appreciation for context, without remembering that we're dealing with people's homes and lives, that's tyranny. And tyranny always backfires." I told them the story then. The woodpile, Karren's complaint, the threats, my decision to stop supplying firewood. I didn't embellish or exaggerate. I didn't make Karren into a monster or myself into a hero. I just told them what happened, step by step, and let them draw their own conclusions. The room was silent. You could hear people shifting in their chairs, but nobody was looking at their phones or whispering to neighbors. They were listening. When I got to the part about Karren filing a complaint against her own observation, several people winced. When I described the attempted fine for not donating firewood, someone actually gasped. And when I explained how the community had come together to create a better system, I saw people nodding, understanding dawning on their faces. The lesson here isn't that HOAs are bad, I concluded. It's that power without empathy is destructive. Every time you enforce a rule, ask yourself, am I doing this to improve the community or to assert my authority? Am I solving a real problem or creating one? And most importantly, would I want to live in a community where I was treated the way I'm treating this person? The applause was genuine and sustained. Afterward, at least 30 people came up to talk to me. Some shared their own horror stories of HOA overreach. Others admitted that they'd been the ones overreaching and hadn't realized it. One woman, a board president from Bozeman, had tears in her eyes. "I've been so focused on enforcing rules that I forgot why we had them," she said. "Last month I fined a single mother for having a slightly overgrown lawn. She'd just lost her job and couldn't afford lawn service. I never even asked if she needed help. I just sent the fine. What are you going to do now? I asked. Rescind the fine, apologize, and organize a community lawn care day where we all help each other catch up on yard work. She smiled through her tears. Thank you for reminding me what community means. That became my favorite part of these speaking engagements, not the presentations themselves, but the conversations afterward, the stories people shared, the commitments they made to do better, the board members who realized they'd become what they'd never wanted to be. Over the next year, I spoke at 23 different events across 5 states. Jennifer and I developed a full curriculum on reasonable HOA governance with sections on legal boundaries, community engagement, conflict resolution, and what we called the empathy test for rule enforcement. Back home in Pinewood Lakes, life continued to improve. The community garden Tom had proposed was thriving, with 16 families participating. The Toolshare program had expanded to include everything from power tools to camping equipment. And the fire pit, that symbol of where everything had started, was the heart of the community again, hosting everything from birthday parties to impromptu Friday night gatherings. Richard, Tom, and I served 2 full terms on the board, then stepped back to let new people take over. We'd accomplished what we'd set out to do, transform the HOA from an enforcement agency into a service organization. The new board members were younger, more diverse, and they'd learned from our example. They focused on facilitating community connections rather than policing compliance. Karren never came back to Pinewood Lakes, as far as I knew. I heard through the grapevine that she was happy in her Spokane condo, had taken up painting, and was generally less stressed without the responsibility of running an HOA. I hoped that was true. She'd been the catalyst for positive change, even if she hadn't intended it that way. One evening, about 18 months after the whole thing started, I was loading firewood into the community woodshed when a young couple approached. They'd just moved into the neighborhood the week before. "Are you Kenneth Xavier?" the man asked. "Guilty. We heard about you, about what you did, standing up to the old board. It's actually one of the reasons we bought here. We wanted a community that valued people over paperwork." His wife nodded enthusiastically. "Our last HOA. Fined us for having a wreath on our door that was the wrong shade of green. We were so tired of that mentality." "Well, you won't find that here," I said. "We've got rules, but they're reasonable. And we've got people who care about each other. That's the important part." "Is it true you supply the firewood?" she asked. "Me and about 20 other households. We rotate. Everyone contributes what they can." "Could we help? I mean, we don't know the system yet, but we'd like to be part of it." I smiled and handed them each a piece of wood from my truck. "Start by bringing this to the shed. Then we'll add you to the rotation." They looked almost honored, carrying those logs like they were precious cargo. It reminded me why all of this had been worth it, not for the recognition or the speaking career, but for moments like this. New residents excited to contribute, to be part of something bigger than themselves. As the sun set over Lake Coeur d'Alene, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I finished loading the woodshed and headed home. My phone buzzed with an email from the Idaho HOA Coalition. They wanted to do a feature article about Pinewood Lakes for their annual report, highlighting it as a model community. They were calling it the Woodpile that changed everything. I laughed and sent back a one-word response. Sure, because it had changed everything. A stack of firewood, neatly organized between 2 trees, had been the catalyst for transforming not just my community, but potentially dozens of others through the training programs. It had turned an HOA from a source of stress into an actual community asset. And it had reminded everyone involved that rules exist to serve people, not the other way around. That night, there was another spontaneous gathering at the fire pit. I brought some of my cherry wood, the kind that smells sweet when it burns. Tom brought marshmallows and chocolate. Richard brought his famous apple cider. And about 40 other people brought themselves, their families, their laughter and stories. As I watched the flames dance and listened to the sound of community around me, I thought about how different things could have been. If I'd just complied with Karren's demand without question, moved my wood and kept supplying the fire pit, none of this would have happened. The community would have continued taking me for granted, Karren would have continued her petty tyranny, and people would have continued being disengaged from their own neighborhood. Sometimes standing up for yourself is the most community-minded thing you can do, because it shows others that they don't have to accept unreasonable treatment either. It sets a standard, creates a precedent, demonstrates that power has limits and must be exercised with wisdom. The fire burned bright, fed by wood from multiple sources, tended by multiple hands, enjoyed by the entire community. That's what it should have been all along. Not one person carrying the load, but everyone contributing. Not authority demanding compliance, but neighbors cooperating voluntarily. I added another log to the fire, watching sparks spiral up into the darkening sky. Somewhere behind me, someone laughed, deep and genuine. A child shrieked happily, running past with a sparkler. Tom started telling a story that had everyone leaning in to hear. This was community. This was what HOAs should be about, and it had all started with a woodpile, a clipboard, and one person deciding that enough was enough. The fire crackled its agreement, warming us all against the cool evening air, bringing light to the darkness, gathering us together in that ancient human ritual of sharing warmth and stories and time. And for once, everything made perfect sense.